Well, thanks, Ann. This is my 4th year at the Legal Services Center. It's a great place. I have extremely wonderful colleagues, and I'm excited to be here today and to moderate this panel. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, starting with my immediate left, Michelle Wu. Michelle is currently a council member of the Boston City Council, but I looked for backgrounds for each of them that related to economic justice, and for all of them, it's just very simple. But Michelle was an entrepreneur before she came to law school, and I talked to Brian Price, who was running the sort of the community economic development clinic here at the Legal Services Center at the time Michelle was going to law school, and he said that he met her on Admitted Students Day, that she came up to him and that she pushed to come and join the clinic before she came to law school, right? So she wasn't just a law school student clinician, she was a pre-law school student member of the LSC community. And he said she did wonderful work. And if you look at the work she's doing with City Council, she's very much appropriately placed on our committee. Next to Michelle is Congressman Joe Kennedy III. And reading his background, I was talking to him like, okay, you between college and law school, you were in the Peace Corps, and you were helping people in the Dominican Republic to organize. The tour guides there doing economic development work in the Dominican Republic. But then I'm reading his thing, and he's next in East Timor, the farthest point in the world probably from Dominican Republic, doing economic development work there. And he. Were you deported? So after that work, before he came to law school, like Michelle, having a background in economic development work, and has gone on from law school to do amazing stuff, becoming a congressman. But if you read, I've read a few of his speeches. I mean, they are heavy into economic development, and so I think we'll hear that today. Next to Joe is Blake Strode. Blake was in the housing clinic here, working with Maureen. But not only working on housing issues in the clinic here, you were doing SPOs. He was doing a multitude of things while in law school related to housing and economic development. And leaving law school, he got a Skadden Fellowship, like others we've heard today, and went back home to St. Louis, and he started working for ArchCity Defenders, and almost 2 years ago, maybe a year and a third ago, he became the director of ArchCity Defenders, where he not only is working in housing, but in many other things in the community, trying to help people to economically make it. And last but certainly not least is Haben Girma. Haben lives in the Bay Area. She came to law school and worked here in LSC in the clinic with my wonderful colleague Julie McCormick, and talking with Julie about Haben's work in the clinic here. Haben represented. Julie only takes the toughest cases. So if you have an easy safety net or Social Security case, you can find a lawyer who will represent you. If you can't find a lawyer who will represent you because they think the case is too hard, then Julie takes that case. And so Haben was working on one of the cases with Julie and won it at the first level, which is very hard to do, and of course saves the client just a tremendous amount of anguish, because another 2 or 3 years could go by. So she did great work here. She also got a Skadden Fellowship. She went and did work defending people, promoting through litigation for a couple of years, economic justice for people with disabilities, and then she decided that she could be more impactful doing broader advocacy work. So that's what she does today from her home in the Bay Area, where she's close to a lot of the tech companies who are doing wonderful things for people with disability, and some not so wonderful things. But she travels the world. I talked to her yesterday. She's headed off to India and then to Singapore. So she's not just advocating for people in the United States, she's advocating for people with disabilities throughout the world. But what we're gonna do today is each of my 4 panelists has 5 minutes 3 times to talk about 3 different topics. So it'll be interesting as the moderator to see how that goes. First, we're going to talk about how did you get involved with economic justice, and how did your Harvard Law School experience shape your views. Then we're going to talk about, has your view of economic justice and your work on economic justice issues evolved after leaving law school. Then we're going to talk about where are we headed as a country and as a world in achieving greater economic justice. But before we launch into each person's 5-minute discussion of those issues, we wanted to give the audience a chance to talk about what is economic justice? What does economic justice mean for you? Because there's a lot of different theories out there on what economic justice is, and we wanted to engage you for a couple of minutes in talking about what that might mean to some of you who are willing to talk to us on this topic. Anybody want to start us off?
Right. Certainly means not runaway capitalism.
Okay. Anyone else?
A basic floor for income and access to health care and access to healthy food.
I would just say access to enact your rights under the Constitution, regardless of your income.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes, sir. Brian?
Bottom line, money.
Access to money.
You need money to live adequately in this country. So all the different ways that people can access money or the impediments to money being removed. And that might be regulatory barriers. That might be institutional barriers. It could be lack of knowledge and information. It could be a number of different things.
Okay.
Can I add economic opportunities not tied to immigration status?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. See?
Global economic justice. I think as the world has become smaller, we see the need to have economic justice in other countries and to share some of what we have because of much more mobile populations and much more mobile economies.
All right. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'm curious about the extent to which economic justice can be distinguished from racial and gender justice in the work.
Okay. All right. So thanks for your participation, and I hope that's not the end of your participation, but I'm going to now switch and give the panelists an opportunity to talk. So Michelle, since you're sitting next to me, I'll start with you, and we'll talk about how you got involved with economic justice and how Harvard shaped your views on that.
Well, good morning, everyone. Or good afternoon at this point. I never know what day it is. Thank you for having us here. It's really an honor to be back here, a place that was actually so formative to my career now in a way that I didn't even realize when I was here, and to be up here with such distinguished guests and friends. This room would appreciate. I actually recently served on a jury. I was selected for jury duty about 2 weeks ago. And what I found relevant for this conversation was the judge, in explaining probable cause and giving the jury instructions, et cetera, kept saying, probable cause is, or reasonable doubt, you should use it a couple different ways, a concept that is difficult to define, but easy to know when you kind of see it. And economic justice to me is the American dream, right? Which is similarly kind of maybe difficult to define, but everyone has a kind of innate sense of what that is. And it's what brought my parents to this country. I think of it as every person's right to be able to move up, to do well, to achieve that sense of happiness and fulfillment and stability for your family, however you define it. And certainly money and the financial stability is a key piece of it, healthcare and food justice and housing. But everyone, I think, has a different conception of how they get to happiness and fulfillment for their family. And we need to make sure that there are no barriers, particularly undue barriers that disproportionately affect neighbors who are low-income residents or people of color or facing additional, who are different in a different way. So when I arrived here, thanks to Brian's generosity and indulgence of a very eager law student, I had just come off of a fresh experience of being very angry about barriers. I had graduated from college and was expecting just to work as a consultant when my mom got sick, had a mental health crisis, and I needed to go back home, stabilize the family situation. At the same time of trying to raise my 2 sisters, help support my mom, and we decided to open a family business to keep us going. I think part of me had felt that my mom had so quickly fell into mental illness that maybe she could be shaken out of it, right? Just naivete and not knowing much at the time. And just, she had always talked about how over the course of raising us as a stay-at-home mom over 30 years, one day she would retire from being a homemaker and own a little tea shop and run a business. And so when she had her mental health crisis at first, my charge was, well, I'm going to be here with my family. I'll open this business. It'll keep us going, and she'll get better, and she'll be able to take it over from me and have her dream, her American dream. The business proved to be fulfilling and beautiful in many ways, except for every interaction with government. And the barriers that I saw that we were facing as just a family trying to create opportunity, create stability for our own lives, were not barriers that other people coming into City Hall faced, because they had an army of consultants and lawyers, and they were not even actually sitting there waiting for hours to reach the counter, because they were able to pay other people to do it for them or call the local city councilor. And it just was very clear that in so many of the situations I was facing with my family, trying to get my sisters into the right school placements, trying to get my mom access to healthcare coverage for her mental illness in a language that was comfortable in a culturally competent setting, opening the business, that services that were supposed to be there to help, agencies that were supposed to be there to help, were not actually accessible to the people who needed the help in that moment. And so that's how I arrived here. And it was so empowering to be able to work with clients who were facing similar situations and not just make it happen for them, but really empower them to make choices and do it themselves. I think that's what I took most from the Legal Services Center, that I think about every day now in my role. The training that when you are working with a client, it is not, they will turn to you, look you in the eyes and say, what should I do? But your job as the advocate, as the attorney, is to understand their situation, help them feel heard, and then explain to them what their options are, make them feel empowered to know exactly what their choices are, and have them make the choice, and then support them in that choice. So that's how I think about my job today on the City Council, is creating the right environment so that everybody can have that equity of making an informed, empowered choice about where they want their lives to go and how they can access resources to support their families.
Thanks, Michelle. And I forgot to mention when I was introducing that Joe is the one panelist who did not come to LSC when he was in law school. He made the choice to join the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau. So so he does. I didn't introduce what he did at LSC for that, but yeah, he has plenty of good reasons for being here today. And
your forgiveness, thank you. So first off, to everybody at LSC, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for the work that you do day in and day out. I am an extraordinary admirer of the people that you serve, how you go about it, the fact that this institution exists, and the inspiration that you provide for generations of law students. Obviously, you see what that means in the faces you see around this room. I'm honored to be here with these panelists as well. Michelle and I have gotten to know each other well over the course of our time in government service. I knew about her before then because of the extraordinary story that I think she told a little bit. She's being as humble as she traditionally is, but for those of you that don't know it, it's as inspiring a story as you will find in government service. And also a big shout out to somebody that, when I think of service, I can think of no higher calling than somebody that married my twin brother. Kate Manning's in the back, Kate Kennedy, who does part of the government, part of the communications work here. Good luck, God bless, and all the rest of it. Yes, thank you. So I guess from my perspective, trying to answer the question as concise as I can, I want to see a bit of the world. Coming out after college, I wasn't quite ready for a desk job, and found myself in the Dominican Republic after work at the UN for a couple of months on the Millennium Development Goals, and at that point, kind of a glorified internship as they were getting a report done, and went from the highest levels of economic development. Not that anybody was necessarily asking my opinion, but other than milk or sugar or both in those meetings, but But seeing economic development from the highest levels, government, massive government intervention, massive government funding, to watching your world shrink to literally 100 yards in a direction as a Peace Corps volunteer. And spending some time in a country that I'd never been in a language that I sort of spoke in Spanish, and people that I didn't know that accepted me as part of their community and cared for me when I was sick and looked out after me. And over time, I very much grew to look at that community as home. And I was working with this group of young men that were getting horribly taken advantage of by a more or less predatory tourism industry, profiting off of the extraordinary work that they were doing, while keeping tourists largely in the dark about how the entire system worked. And I was able to take advantage of a little known law to help reconfigure some of those incentives to not necessarily get them a great deal, but a better deal to try to align those incentives and make investments back in themselves and their community and their organization, which has been pretty successful even all these years later. It's actually kind of always duct tape and chewing gum and a finger in each crack in the dam, but it's still shockingly working. About a half mile away from where I was living, it was in this series of mountains that came out into a big sugarcane plain, and it was the community had been basically hollowed out. It was an old sugar refinery for folks that were harvesting sugarcane. They closed down a plant years before I got there, in privatization of the industry, but it was still home to a large portion of Haitians that would come over and live in essentially barns that were called bateys, and were there to provide the manual labor to cut the sugarcane. And for those of you that know the history between the Dominican Republic and Haiti and race relations and Spanish, French, and all the rest of it, it was extraordinary for me to see a community that accepted me and embraced me, and good, decent, generous, kind people that also showed this level of hostility to others that were scraping by on the literally lowest of margins. And as I started to peel back the layers on that, starting to understand a bit more of it, and I walked through the community of bateys. There were several hundred people living in these series of barns. There's one outhouse, one family had a key, and it was locked. And so Peace Corps had a fund to try to provide latrines, and the basic project was the community will dig the hole, the family digs a hole, we provide the resources, and we build the little outhouse together. And it was about as squalor as you will find anywhere in the developing world. And so I modified that project a bit, and I brought the resources in, and over the course of the next several months, for several hundred people, any idea how many latrines I built? 0. And I couldn't figure out what the heck I was doing wrong, but I was clearly doing something wrong, because it wasn't that these folks didn't know that they were born. It wasn't that they didn't know that they were sick. And somebody then pointed out that that was an economy largely built on exploitation, where the moment that a Haitian family invested in themselves or in their future, they could be deported because there was an infinite labor supply, because as bad as it was there, it was worse in parts of Haiti. And the moment they actually took power to empower themselves in their future, they were gone. And how the consequences of that led to stereotypes and de facto racism. And I was struck by the fact that I was able to leverage the power of the law to actually create this economic development project that led to tens of thousands of dollars of investment from the UN and USAID to help lift up the Dominican community. And a half mile away, with laws, anti-discrimination laws that were already on the books, couldn't leverage them to actually try to provide for a decent, literally the most marginal step up for a community that was being even more heavily exploited. And how the law could allow one and not the other. And so I wanted to go to law school. And so I went, and I was disappointed not to find the answer in the first year of law school. And so the place where I did find as the best answer to it was the Legal Aid Bureau. No offense to you guys at the LSC. But it was I remember the first time walking through Roxbury with the then head of the Legal Aid Bureau, David Grossman, and as most talented a lawyers you will find anywhere in any courtroom in this country. And the credibility that he had with the local community while he was walking through a whole bunch of overly eager law students that you could only describe as looking lost on those same streets in Roxbury. The credibility that he had built up through a lifetime of service of making the choice to be able to actually take those talents and serve that community. and what that then meant for somebody that understood the structures of the way that they could be used to empower and exploit. And I have then wanted to try to find out how the law can be used and how it is used in ways that some of which are obvious and others are far more subtle, but equally as devastating, to exploit and to build up structures of an economic society that has been based off of, to the extent of that, some of that systemic exploitation that was commented on earlier. And how we can recalibrate those, not necessarily for the end goal of redistribution, but for the end goal of empowering American families to be able to meet the needs for their own families, to meet that basic promise enshrined in our documents about a pursuit of happiness. Doesn't mean you actually get there, but it does mean that our structures of our society, our government, should empower families to be able to pursue it. And at the moment, I think you're seeing the ramification of a society that, despite all of that, actually those structures do not do so. And then the frustration and the tension that then comes when more and more families start to find that political voice and are willing to raise it up to fight for and to call out the fact that those structures are not empowering them, but are still holding them back.
Hello, everyone. First, I also want to thank Keith for moderating this panel. Thank you to Dan, Marguerite, and the LSC team for this event. It's been really great this morning to hear the first couple of panels, and they raised up so much that it's also been challenging to try to refocus, because so much of what people said resonated with me. Part of what Keith asked us to think about was sort of those early, our early experiences that helped to shape our thoughts around economic justice and justice generally. And I am from St. Louis, Missouri. Of course, I work in St. Louis now at ArchCity Defenders. I'm also born and raised in St. Louis. And like too many other American cities, St. Louis is a region that is extremely fragmented, extremely segregated, and struggling with severe inequity across various lines. And I grew up sort of moving back and forth over many of those lines. And one of the things that St. Louis is sort of known for is this thing called the Del Mar Divide. Some of you may have heard or read about this. And it's literally a street in St. Louis that divides north and south. And within a couple of blocks of this particular street, which runs through most of the city and county, you will have stately mansions and manicured lawns on one side and dilapidated public housing on the other side. And one side is almost entirely white and the other is almost entirely black, in a region that really is defined in terms of black and white. And one of my really formative experiences, I think, was right there on that Del Mar Divide. I attended an elementary school. I was talking to Roger last night, who lived in U City, where I attended elementary school at a place called Del Mar Harbor that sat along this Del Mar Divide. And that meant that I had this very unique experience for someone from St. Louis of actually having classmates that sort of spanned these racial and economic categories, people that were very privileged, very well off, and people that came from families that were having a really hard go of it, that were living in poverty, that had family entangled in the criminal legal system. And so very early on, without having really yet the sort of political understanding of what I was experiencing and seeing, I was experiencing the American divide, that gulf that exists between the ability to pursue all of your dreams, as someone said, and the reality that you're just trying to survive every day. And one of the people that stands out most clearly in my mind when I think back to that time was a classmate of mine who was just incredibly kind, sweet girl whose family had just immigrated from Cameroon. And they were very poor. and she was still learning English. She still had a fairly thick accent. And so she sounded a little bit different. She looked different than most of the other kids. She was a dark-skinned girl, had glasses, short hair she usually wore, sort of in barrettes. And the other kids were very cruel to her. And they would pick on her, and they would talk about her clothes. They would say she got all her clothes from the Goodwill, which was the highest insult at that time. This was before hipsters made the Goodwill cool. So you didn't want to have hand-me-down clothes. And I remember watching her, and she was so kind to people. You know, she never responded with cruelty. And eventually, and I probably watched and did nothing for too long, to be honest. And then eventually it just sort of seemed so wrong, so unfair that people were treating her this way, that I remember making the conscious decision that I was just going to sit with her at lunch. I was going to talk to her. If someone said something cruel to her, I would speak up. And so I started doing that for a little while. And fairly quickly, because at 6 years old, kids aren't used to confrontation. So the first time you sort of say back to someone, leave her alone, she's doing, people sort of started to back off of it, started to at least ignore her, if not treat her with a little more kindness. And I don't share that, to make myself look good, because truthfully, I watched far more than I participated in. But it was my first experience, I think, of seeing what it meant to stand with someone as they are enduring injustice, as they are enduring hardship. And I saw it again many years later as a law student in some of the SPOs that you described and here at the Legal Services Center. When I really thought about our role, and I think about our role at ArchCity Defenders to this day, as being taking the hands of our clients, standing with them, and telling this train that's headed at them full steam to stop, and doing everything we can together to make it stop. And whether we're talking about economic justice or criminal justice or gender justice, to go to Jeff's point, because I do think really you can't distinguish these things. But that's the role of a social justice lawyer. That's the role of an advocate, not to have all the answers, but to stand with people who are facing down injustice every day and create community, create solidarity, and use the tools that we have to help sort of stop that oncoming train. And so we do that at ArchCity Defenders to the best of our ability every day in issues of housing, criminal justice, homelessness. And I think that that LSC and the partners that LSC works with are so critical in helping to provide a model. It's really important to model for people what that kind of partnership and community looks like. And so I'm really grateful for the experiences that I had here and really try to the best of my ability to implement lessons that I learned here in my daily work at ArchCity.
Thanks, Blake. So Haben, if you can also address the formation of your pursuit of economic justice, that would be great.
Absolutely. So my name is Haben Girma, and I'm deafblind. I have limited vision and hearing. And during this panel, I'm using a communication system that uses a Braille keyboard and a wireless computer. So interpreters are typing on the keyboard, and I'm reading in digital Braille. When I was in college, I wanted to be able to spend my summers making an income and getting a summer job, just like lots of other college students. And one of my best friends told me, Juneau, Alaska has lots of summer jobs. Let's go to Alaska. And I said, sure. Before going, I did my homework. I did research. I applied for jobs ahead of time. And I had an impressive resume. I was valedictorian at my high school. My college grades were excellent. I did volunteer work in Mali, West Africa, and in my community in Oakland, California. So employers were impressed by my resume, and I got a job even before going to Alaska. It was to be a tour guide at their Capitol building, giving tours over the summer. On my first day there, they pulled me aside and said, "Sorry, we made a mistake." And I said, "Is this because I'm blind?" And they said, no, it has nothing to do with your disability. We just made a mistake." So then I was stuck looking for jobs. And as my friend said, there are lots of summer jobs in Juneau, Alaska. They have a huge tourism industry. So I applied for the jobs. People were excited by my resume. They'd invite me for an interview. But once they found out I had a disability, they would turn me away. This went on for weeks. Lots of jobs coming in over the internet, lots of interviews, but no one wanted to hire me. It was deeply frustrating. 70% of blind people are unemployed. Many of us work really hard, do well, do lots of things we're told to do, like doing well in school, doing volunteer work, and yet society still rejects us. I was really worried. What would I do once I graduated from college? What would my future hold? If working hard doesn't work, then what's going to work? Near the end of the summer, a friend who had a job opening, and it was a part-time job working at a gym in Juneau, Alaska. And I said, "I'll take it." Because I was willing to do anything, laundry at hotel, doing dishes, anything. So she showed me how to clean the rooms in the gym, how to use all the equipment, how to use the cash register, and I did that. One day, a woman came into the gym and said, "One of the treadmills are not working." And I said, "Okay, show me which one." We went over to the treadmill. I tried the on button. That wouldn't work. I tried the other buttons. That didn't work. So I felt the machine from top to bottom, and on the bottom, there was a switch. When I turned it on, the machine came to life. The woman was thrilled. She said, "Oh my goodness, I didn't see that switch." I told her I didn't see it either. People with disabilities are talented. We have alternative ways of doing things. If you can't see something, you can access it another way, like through touch. Or if you can't hear language, you can use sign language or other solutions. And people with disabilities are extremely creative and talented, but society constantly rejects us. So that summer I learned, even though I'm talented, most employers are going to assume that I'm not competent. So I wanted to step back and think, what can I do? How can I change the system? And I learned about disability rights advocates, and I wanted to be one of them and help create changes that would create more opportunities for people with disabilities. So I came to Harvard, and here at LSC, I worked with Julie, helping people with disabilities with their social security claims. A lot of these people have faced similar discrimination like me. Employers are assuming that we can't do a job, and it's extremely frustrating. And then the social security system is super complicated and creates more barriers for individuals. So it was really rewarding to be able to step in and help out. And since then, I've been using my talents to increase opportunities for people, starting out with litigation. And I worked at a law firm that sued organizations that violated the ADA. After that, I switched over to training and education, and now I provide trainings for organizations from schools to tech companies on why choosing inclusion benefits all of us. People with disabilities are one of the largest minority groups, any of us can join this group at any time. All our bodies change, and we deserve dignity at every stage of our lives. And so that's what I do now.
I'm not sure we'll get through my entire agenda here, but we're going to talk now about sort of and you've all touched on it, but more about what you've learned, post law school. How has your work post law school affected your view of economic justice and what can be done? Michelle, I'll start with you again.
When I ran for office the first time, I was 27 and had a sense that from the inside, you can do things very quickly with the right energy, with the right approach, particularly at the local level when people can see constituents face to face. I also had a sense that many of the solutions are already out in the community, that people are every day doing their best to take care of their part of the world, whether it's a school community, a park, a business, a street, etc. I didn't know how much I didn't know at that time. And in the 6 years that I've been in office, I think it's both been a continual humbling to realize just how much families are doing, just how much balancing and juggling and sacrifice is going on that most of the world doesn't see, because our systems, our institutions are set up in very narrow ways that even to advocate, even to enact or to implement your given rights to appear before your government and plead your case or suggest a change, petition for a policy improvement, you have to fit in a very narrow box of being able to come to City Hall during the workday, to wait the hours until after all the officials have spoken, to testify for 2 minutes only, and in that format, to have some sort of change come after that. I feel that as if I've been sort of radicalized over my time in government to return back to the sense that we need people who are on the inside, who are sitting at tables, to really spend as much time as possible outside of those spaces and in community, lifting up the solutions that are already out there. And so I think that's where we're at now. The Congressman kind of referenced this a little bit in talking about how the kind of political ramifications of a breakdown in the policy structures and the disconnect between people, their daily lives, and what they feel that people who have the ability, the power, the sort of legal power to change things, how far away that experience is from actually changing things and helping. And the solution's pretty simple, I think. It's just about opening everything up and bringing everyone in to make sure that the decisions are being made by people who are closest to the actual challenges, the actual issues. That is happening now at a national scale. There's an incredible movement and energy in our politics. And at the local level, we just see it happening at a hyper accelerated pace. There's so much that we could do, and there's so many people ready to get involved. I think there's just a tremendous role for people who have specialized knowledge and training, particularly attorneys, particularly people whose hearts are there to make a difference and try to support this change, to just be out there and in some ways translate or amplify the solutions that community already has. And so I feel incredibly, I feel a sense of urgency that the big problems that we have been dealing with as a country for generations now, we cannot afford to pass them down one more generation, whether it's income inequality, racial disparities, climate change. This is the 10-year window that we need to really fix the structural issues. And that's an exciting time to be proud of. It's a lot of pressure, but most of all, it's just motivation keep people, more and more people getting involved, more and more people coming to these decision-making tables, and just being quiet and listening to what they have to say and then following their instructions.
So I think a couple things. One, building off experience at the Legal Aid Bureau, some of the time at Peace Corps, one of the central lessons from me and my service in the Peace Corps was that this kind of cliche takeaway: things are the way they are for a reason, and if you want to change it, it's worth trying to figure out what the underlying reason is. And I think it gets back to take the obvious, to what Brian alluded to a long time ago, earlier today, was just money and power. But you combine that with what our new House Speaker said over the course of the last midterm election to me at one point was, look, this is about power, and no one's just going to give it to you. Republicans aren't going to give this to us to give us a shot. You got to go out there and take it. That has to be fought for, and it has to be won. And being in the Legal Aid Bureau, doing housing work in the midst of a foreclosure crisis, 2007, 8, 9, sitting in Elizabeth Warren's bankruptcy class when she was overseeing TARP, and we were going through the details of bankruptcy code, and understanding the ability that we had to leverage landlord-tenant law and housing law here in Massachusetts to try to keep people in their homes, but then also recognizing that keeping one person in their home, as significant and as important as that was, is not going to stop the underlying structural aspects that have led this to come about in the first place. And so how do you start to peel those levers back? And how do you then build up the coalitions that are going to be necessary to fight through the power and money that profits off of the status quo? And how hard it is to try to do that, and how necessary the fight over every single inch along that way actually is. And that, unfortunately, became very clear to me as a brand new member, well, I guess as a freshman member of the minority party in the House of Representatives, which means you're about as influential as a doormat. That change wasn't going to come quickly, but that it can be used to use that time to do your best to start to understand what those underlying power structures are, where the pivot points are, meet and get to know and empower the people that know this better than you do, and that have been working on those streets and in those communities longer than you have, and to try to fight and scratch and claw your way forward to be able to push for every inch. And then when you have those inflection points, you take them. But to know that those big, broad structures, when it comes to federal policy out of the United States government, the richest nation in the world, the most powerful democracy in the world, with significant resources to back the reasons why things are the way they are, to change that is going to be tough, but it can be changed. And we have seen it be changed. Finish very briefly, but by far, in my own opinion, the most optimistic person in the House of Representatives, and it isn't even close, is John Lewis, civil rights icon. And I think there's a lot to that, but the shortest answer for that is he's a man that over the course of his lifetime, not only has he been let down over and over again by the authorities that were supposed to protect him, protect what he stands for, and over 40 different arrests in so many different states across our country, but somebody that over the course of his life, because in no small part because of his blood and his sacrifice, has also seen a country adapt to be a far more tolerant and inclusive place than it was when he was walking across an Edmund Pettus Bridge as a young man. Now, we have an awfully long way to go. I don't mean to diminish any of the challenges that everybody else up here has spoken to, or that you all fight for every day. But to be with somebody that actually can give voice to the fact that that progress can be made if you have enough good people that are willing to go out there and fight for it. That's our mission.
Well, I think the dirty little secret, which many of the people in this room are in on, is that the law actually either has created or cemented the very fundamental injustices that we're now working against. So that creates this sort of baseline question of what the heck is a lawyer to do with the tools of the thing that's creating the injustice that we purport to fight against every day. And when I came to law school, it was the first time that I remember looking through the course offerings, and I had never seen the phrase poverty law in my life, never heard it. I'm fairly politically engaged. I'm not in Congress or anything, but I keep up with
Give it
things.
time. Not yet. Not yet.
I pay attention. Never heard that phrase, and thought it was such a strange way. But then I read the course offering. I was like, oh, all the stuff I care about is in poverty law. It's not called racism law or classism law or just injustice generally, but that's what it is. And it's a weird way in which we've sort of compartmentalized, because in the law and in legal practice, we have to have a name for everything, and we have to have a particular practice area. And so the way that we've sort of bundled all of the injustice that we see is to say we're poverty lawyers, or maybe public interest lawyers, social justice lawyers. And to me, it's a weird kind of redundancy in that phrase of poverty law, because of course the law dictates whether or not poverty exists. You could create a legal framework in which there is no poverty. There are places that have more or less done this. And we choose instead a legal framework that inevitably creates poverty and then create jobs for ourselves to try to break down at the margins, pieces of that, that social structure. And so I think the goal that we should all have, and certainly the goal that I think of our work as having, is to work ourselves out of a job. That most of us who are in the public interest sphere, who are doing social justice work, if we did our jobs right, would get to a point where we're no longer necessary. And this sort of goes to the earlier conversation that was thinking about sort of structurally and institutionally, how sort of public interest work works and doesn't work, how it's effective and is ineffective. But I think what it certainly means, and another reason that I'm grateful for my experience here, is that lawyers oftentimes have to take a back seat to broader social movements, have to take a back seat to community building, to building power in communities, and to ask questions instead of think that we're always providing the answer. Oftentimes the best we can do is stop the worst thing from happening. And the actual dreaming, the actual building of something affirmatively can't happen through legal work. It's just a tool, but it has to be creating space for organizing, creating space for activism, creating space for a different kind of forward thinking that the law is inherently bad at, because the law is backward thinking by nature. And so whether you're in, when I first was in court with Maureen and Julie in the housing court in Boston, and saw for the first time what court actually looks like for poor people, which was nothing like what I'd seen on Law and Order. It was just, it was chaos. And people were sort of running around looking for what courtroom they were supposed to be in, who they needed to talk to. We were trying to hand out sort of pro se information and answer basic questions. And it looks exactly the same. That's a housing court, that's in housing practice, or maybe you could classify that as economic justice work. It looks exactly the same as municipal courts in St. Louis County. It looks exactly the same as our associate circuit court that deals with traffic matters and people that haven't paid debts. It looks exactly the same. It looks different than a hearing for a Fortune 500 company in a complex interaction over whether or not they're going to have to pay out on a multi-million-dollar contract. That's much more organized. but for anyone that is actually just trying to prevent injustice in their lives, our system is not formulated to make that doable or possible or likely. And so I think what we have to think about as people that believe in economic justice, as people that believe in racial justice, as people that believe in social justice, is how lawyers and legal actors can support movements that will envision and create and build a different kind of world and a different kind of society. And that's what I'm really interested in, and that's what we try to do in all of our collaborative work.
Haben, how has your post-law school experience framed your economic justice views?
So one of the biggest surprises for me when I graduated from law school and started working at a law firm is how slow everything is. I really wanted things to move faster. The ADA was passed in 1990, and it's been around for maybe 28, 29 years now. It's super frustrating that there's still huge unemployment for people with disabilities. The law is one way to make change, but I decided to pause and ask myself, what else can I offer the disability community? What are all my talents and strengths? And how can I use this to help the community? When I was at HLS, I actually did a TEDx organized by Blake and other classmates. And it was one of my first opportunities to use advocacy and story to help educate the community about disability rights and inclusion. And I've continued to do that since. And having a story that inspires people gives me the opportunity to help people and organizations move from inspiration to action, to actually make changes that increase opportunities. So I work with tech companies to build solutions so that when people with disabilities go into a workplace or a school, they can actually use the tools like the school's websites or an employer's management software. Those are currently barriers that many people with disabilities face when they try to get jobs. They don't need to exist. Computers start out as ones and zeros, and programmers have the ability to convert that information into visual graphics, audio for people who listen, braille for people who prefer to access information this way, lots of different options. And when these companies build services in multiple formats, they reach more people, which is more revenue for them. So everybody wins. We often see disability as charity. I want to change the story, and I want people to assume that we're competent and assume that we add value to society. I also work with Pearson Education to increase mentorship opportunities within companies so that once someone gets a job, they have opportunities to advance and have mentors and continue learning. So many different ways to be a lawyer, many different ways to help our communities.
All right, so now we'll look at the last of the three. We don't have quite as much time for discussion here, but kind of building on what Joe said, how can we be optimistic about the future of attaining economic justice, or can we be optimistic, Michelle?
I think we have no other choice but to figure it out in this window that we have. And every sign that I see on the ground out in the community is that we're going to do it, that people are ready, that more people from every background are running for office, that residents who didn't necessarily feel that they needed to vote in every single election are now realizing the importance of getting involved, that, and most importantly, I think that in Boston, which is a city so segregated and so divided into neighborhoods with distinct and unique identities and histories and loyalties, if we can demonstrate here what happens when people start to care not just about themselves, not just about their families, not just about their immediate community, but that we all have a stake in what happens in every part of the city, we have the resources to put all the to demonstrate that's how we unlock opportunity for everyone. As Haben has been saying, that's how we reach every bit of talent that is out there waiting to be offered and waiting to contribute. So I feel confident that it's just going to be a matter of marshaling all of the hard work that people in the community are organizing around and opening up the door so that they actually have an outlet to directly shape policy.
So, building a little bit off of what Blake said, look, at least for me, as I travel around the country and talk to my colleagues down in DC, and it's an amazing opportunity that I have because I interact with 435 different people, 434 different people from literally every corner of this country every week, and recognize that be blunt about it, for a pretty good, nearly half of my colleagues, the favorability rating of Donald Trump in their district is in the mid to high 90s, right? Who look at the White House and are proud that he is there, are proud of the message that he's sending, and are proud of our government. Not exactly the way most of my constituents feel about it, but the way that they feel about it. And so I think the big shot across my bow over the course of the past, election night, 2016, was that if we thought things were going as well as we thought they were, you wouldn't have gotten the outcome that we got. And that for an awful lot of communities, that for those of us in positions, potentially positions of influence, that thought our institutions were reflective of the voices across our society, it turns out that maybe they weren't as reflective of them or inclusive of them as we thought that they were. And so as we are, I think without question, in this moment of political, economic, and cultural transition in our country, I don't know how long that's going to be. I don't know if that's a decade or if that's 20 years or if that's 2 years. But I do know that we are in the midst of an inflection point. And so I think the issue for all of us is, from my perspective at a policy level, how do we diagnose these challenges accurately enough to adjust the structures of the law to be more inclusive and adaptive? But for those of us that are, particularly in this room, that leverage the law every single day, how do we make sure that the institutions, organizations, and such that we contribute to and run are doing that as well? And asking that question of, are we empowering the communities we wish to serve as well as we actually think we are? And the obvious answer from my perspective, for the one that I am a part of, is no, we're not. And so forcing many of us, myself included, to kind of go back and sharpen those pencils a little bit to say, hey, what are those assumptions that we took for granted, and how do we make sure we're doing a better job of listening to those voices and empowering those voices and understanding that there's a lot of voices out there that we still, despite all of those efforts, are not hearing because they don't feel like they can speak, and they're not going to be listened to.
You asked about optimism, and one of my great heroes, intellectual role models, is Dr. Cornel West, and he often talks about the distinction between optimism and hope, and that optimism is a sort of assumption that things will get better, that it's sort of a certainty that things will get better, which is distinguished from this idea of hope, which looks at how far we've come, the sort of human spirit that you see in freedom struggles over generations, that suggests that is the spirit that's in all of us that we just have to access and can access. And so in a similar sense, I think optimism doesn't so much resonate with me as does a sense of hope. And the reason that I'm hopeful about where we can go and where I believe in some sense it's our destiny to ensure that we go, is what I see every day in St. Louis. I mean, I'm in that, I work and live in that flyover country that people are so obsessed about, if not somewhat condescendingly. And I see, you know, St. Louis is its own sort of cosmopolitan city within Missouri. But you don't have to go very far to be in one of these Trump districts. To, you know, my parents live in St. Charles, just over the Missouri River, which is certainly a conservative area, certainly a pro-Trump area. And so, you know, I see people who have very divergent views and who, in my mind, are far too complacent in the face of many of the injustices that we're talking about. And it's hard to be, I mean, it's impossible for me to be optimistic and even challenging to be hopeful in the face of the kinds of inequity that I see when we work with people who are in jail. You know, we have thousands of people in jail in our region because they can't afford some amount of money to get themselves out. 86% of the incarcerated population in St. Louis is Black, even though only 49% of the population is Black. Hundreds of people sleep on the streets every night. Thousands more are facing eviction. I mean, those are really stark realities. And we have people that are raising their voices. We have organizers and activists. We have people that were activated during the Ferguson uprising that have remained in that work and that are leading the charge in St. Louis. We have impacted people who, against all odds, are finding the strength to tell their stories and to demand change and to be at the forefront. And so all of that makes me incredibly hopeful. And I can't help but be inspired every day by our clients. You know, people give us the credit, you know, give my staff at ArchCity Defenders the credit for a lot of the work that we're doing. And we have an amazing team that does wonderful work. But I'm quick to remind people that it really is nothing compared to what our clients are facing down and surviving every single day. And I think that provides inspiration for me, and I believe and hope it provides inspiration for all people that are engaged in this work.
Haben, you have the last word here. Are you optimistic about the future of economic justice, or how do you see it?
The last word, here we go. I'm very optimistic. I believe that people are ultimately good and want to do the right thing. I think a lot of the discrimination against people with disabilities is unintentional. Non-disabled people not thinking about disability. It's hard to imagine a life with a completely different body. All of our bodies change. If we're lucky, we grow old and develop disabilities. But very few of us stop to think and pause and reflect on what that means. Social media actually makes me optimistic because for the first time, a lot of voices that are rarely heard, especially disabled voices, are able to share their stories. And I'm tapped into many disability groups that share their stories, that share struggles they encounter and solutions that come up. Technology does have the potential to equalize everything, but we need to build it and design it in a way where everyone has an opportunity to share their voice. And I'm hopeful people do that. I'm optimistic that we'll do that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful comment.